Late at night, on a deserted street, an officer allows himself to molest a young woman, confident of his impunity. But when her husband shows up, he's speechless. Subscribe to find out what happened next, and post in the comments where you're watching from. Late into the evening, a stillness settled over the city. Street lights cast long shadows across empty sidewalks, and the occasional distant hum of a passing car was the only sound breaking the quiet. Leah pulled her jacket tightly around her shoulders as she exited the office building. It had been another long day, and though she was tired, there was a quiet satisfaction in her steps. She had completed her tasks, pushing through the work with the kind of diligence and resilience she had learned over years of hard work. But tonight, a small sense of relief accompanied her exhaustion. She felt a hint of freedom in the brisk night air. The night was a familiar, almost comforting companion. Leah had often walked home at this hour, each step echoing in the quiet streets, with only the occasional passerby or car breaking the solitude. But as she moved along, a subtle unease began to creep into her thoughts, like an uninvited guest lurking in the shadows of her mind. She quickened her pace, a faint shiver running down her spine. It wasn't fear, not exactly. She had always been proud of her strength, her ability to handle herself in any situation. Yet, as a young black woman in a world that sometimes felt unwelcoming, there was always a quiet, underlying tension in the back of her mind, especially in these solitary, vulnerable moments. Reaching for her phone, Leah sent a quick message to her friend, Maya, who had been her confidant since college. They had both faced the challenges of entering the business world as women of color, and Maya understood Leah's struggles more than anyone else. "Heading home, long day. Hope you're already curled up with that book you mentioned." She added a winking emoji, hoping the light-hearted tone would mask her lingering nerves. Almost immediately, her phone buzzed with a response. "Girl, I'm already 3 chapters in, but text me when you're home safe, all right?" Leah smiled at the message, feeling a small sense of comfort wash over her. Maya had always been her rock, the friend who knew how to balance encouragement with a dose of realism. Their conversations often veered from serious topics, like their dreams and frustrations, to light-hearted banter. Tonight was no exception. "Promise, don't get too lost in that fantasy world without me," Leah replied, feeling a bit of her earlier unease ease up. The conversation served as a brief escape, a reminder of the bright spots in her life amid the challenges. Leah had big dreams. She wanted to rise in her field, to be recognized for her hard work, to lead. But those dreams also came with sacrifices and, often, isolation. There were few who understood her determination or her desire to break free from the limitations others had set for her. Her ambitions set her apart, yet they also made her a target for judgment and scrutiny, a reality she had accepted but sometimes resented. Lost in thought, she almost didn't notice the sudden change in the atmosphere around her. The street seemed quieter, the air heavier. The familiar comfort of the street lights now felt like an intrusion, their harsh glow casting long, eerie shadows. Each step seemed to echo louder than the last. She paused for a moment, looking around and noticing the emptiness. Her footsteps were the only sound, and the solitude she once found comforting now felt oppressive. In the silence, she heard a faint shuffling sound coming from behind her. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to send a jolt through her. She resisted the urge to turn around too quickly, instead glancing back over her shoulder with casual curiosity. Her heart skipped a beat when she noticed a group of men standing under one of the street lights, watching her. They were just silhouettes at first, blending into the shadows, but as she walked, they began to move as well, mirroring her pace. A lump formed in her throat as she quickened her steps, focusing on the sound of her heels clicking against the pavement. She tightened her grip on her phone, considering calling Maya, but she didn't want to worry her friend unnecessarily. "Stay calm," she told herself. "Don't give them the satisfaction of seeing your fear." But her heart hammered in her chest, her earlier confidence waning as the men continued to follow her. The men closed the distance, and she could hear them now. Low murmurs, laughter, the distinct tone of voices that were too familiar with crossing boundaries. One of them called out, his voice dripping with mock friendliness. "Hey there, sweetheart. Where are you rushing off to?" Ignoring them felt like the safest option. Leia kept her gaze forward, pretending not to hear, but they continued, each comment bolder and more intrusive. "No need to be so shy," another voice chimed in. She clenched her jaw, each step feeling heavier than the last, as the familiar comfort of her neighborhood faded into the background of her anxiety. Her pace quickened further, hoping they'd lose interest and let her be, but their footsteps only grew louder, and the realization sank in. She was alone with no one around to intervene. In the brief silence that followed, she felt a surge of anger flare within her, mingling with her fear. She was exhausted from the day, from the constant need to prove herself, and now she couldn't even walk home in peace. The injustice of it all made her want to scream, but she held herself back, determined not to let them see her vulnerability. She remembered the words her father had once told her, back when she was just a little girl. "Never let anyone make you feel small. Stand tall, even when it feels impossible." Taking a deep breath, she forced herself to slow down, reclaiming some of her composure. She didn't owe these men anything, not her fear, not her attention. Yet, as they closed in, she couldn't deny the uneasy truth. Standing tall might not be enough to protect her tonight. The city lights flickered above her as she continued down the street, the men's voices echoing behind her. Each step felt heavier, each shadow longer, as she fought to hold on to her resolve. Leia's heart beat loudly in her chest as she walked faster, the footsteps behind her echoing closer. She could feel the men's eyes on her, their voices growing louder as they closed the distance between them. Her fingers gripped her phone tightly, and she considered calling someone, anyone, but a part of her hesitated, not wanting to reveal the fear simmering just beneath the surface. She told herself it was just a few men looking for some attention, nothing more, but a small voice inside reminded her of the stories she had heard, stories of women caught alone at night, vulnerable and unseen. When she reached the bus stop, Leia paused, hoping that they might pass by or lose interest. But instead, they stopped a few feet away, forming a loose semicircle around her. Their gazes were penetrating, invasive, sizing her up as though she were an object to be analyzed rather than a person standing alone in the dark. "Hey, sweetheart," one of them sneered, stepping forward. His smile was wide and insincere, his eyes glinting under the dim streetlight. "Why so quiet? You look like you could use some company." Leia kept her gaze straight ahead, determined not to engage. She knew from experience that sometimes the best way to handle harassment was to ignore it, to avoid giving them the reaction they wanted. But her silence only seemed to fuel their taunts. Another man stepped closer, his expression darkening as he realized she wasn't going to respond. "What? You think you're too good for us?" he spat, his tone shifting from mock friendliness to barely disguised hostility. "Look at you, all alone out here. Where's that confidence now?" Leia felt a surge of fear mixed with anger rise within her. She wanted to speak, to tell them to leave her alone, but the words caught in her throat. She didn't want to provoke them, to give them any reason to escalate. Her fingers trembled as she glanced down at her phone, debating whether to dial for help, but the thought of waiting for someone to arrive seemed futile in this moment. She was on her own. Then a voice from the group caught her off guard. It was a familiar voice, one she hadn't expected to hear in this place. She looked up and saw one of the men giving her a look of recognition, a spark of surprise in his eyes. "Wait a minute. Leia?" he said, sounding momentarily caught off guard. She narrowed her eyes, trying to place him, and after a moment, it clicked. He was an old acquaintance of her friend Maya, someone she'd met at a party once. She hadn't thought much of him at the time, just another face in the crowd. But now, seeing him here among this group of strangers, his presence felt like a betrayal. "Yeah, I remember you," he continued, his expression shifting from surprise to something else, something darker. "You're friends with Maya, right? Small world." Leia didn't respond. She could see him debating something in his mind, as though weighing whether his connection to her was enough to change his behavior. But whatever sense of recognition there was quickly faded, replaced by the same leering look she'd seen on the others. Any hope she had that he might show her a modicum of respect evaporated in that moment, leaving her feeling more exposed than ever. The men began talking among themselves, their voices low and mocking. They traded comments about her appearance, her figure, each remark more invasive than the last. She could feel the heat of their eyes on her, a sensation that made her skin crawl. She took a step back, her gaze darting around, searching for a way out. But the street was deserted, the only light coming from the flickering bulb above the bus stop. She was trapped, isolated with no one to call out to for help. One of the men reached out, brushing his hand against her arm, a touch that felt both casual and deeply intrusive. Leia jerked her arm back, her heart racing as she fought the urge to lash out. The man chuckled, clearly pleased by her reaction, and the others laughed along with him, their voices echoing in the empty street. "Come on now," he said, his tone light but with a hint of menace. "No need to be so rude. We're just trying to get to know you better." Leia's mind raced as she tried to think of a way to defuse the situation. She knew that any sign of fear would only embolden them, but the anger simmering beneath her calm exterior was difficult to contain. She had worked hard to be taken seriously, to be respected, and now here she was, reduced to a target of unwanted attention simply because she had dared to walk home alone. For a moment, she considered speaking up, confronting them head-on, but the memory of similar situations, stories she'd heard from friends, warnings from family, flashed through her mind. Confrontation could be dangerous, unpredictable. Instead, she took a deep breath, grounding herself in her father's words once again. "Stand tall, Leia. Don't let them see your fear." But as she straightened her shoulders, another man stepped closer, his hand reaching out once again. This time, he didn't just brush her arm. He grabbed her wrist, his fingers digging into her skin with a firm grip. Her stomach twisted, a cold wave of panic washing over her. She tried to pull her arm away, but his grip tightened, his smirk widening as he enjoyed her discomfort. "What's the matter?" he asked, his voice laced with a mocking sweetness. "Don't you like a little attention?" Leia's breathing quickened as she struggled to stay calm. She shot a desperate glance down the street, hoping against hope that someone, anyone, might appear. But the street remained empty, the silence around her oppressive. She was trapped, cornered by these men with no one to come to her aid. In the midst of her fear, another emotion surfaced, a burning anger, a rage at the unfairness of it all. She had done nothing to deserve this, nothing to warrant this kind of treatment. And yet, here she was, forced to defend her right to exist peacefully in a world that constantly sought to undermine her. The men laughed, clearly relishing in her discomfort, their voices blending together into a cruel symphony. But, as Leia struggled, she remembered her inner strength, the resilience that had carried her through so many challenges. She had faced discrimination, doubt, and prejudice, yet had always emerged stronger. In that moment, something shifted inside her. She was tired of being a passive participant in her own life, tired of allowing others to dictate how she should feel or act. She would not allow these men to take away her dignity. With a steady voice, she looked up, meeting the gaze of the man holding her wrist. "Let go of me," she said firmly, her tone brooking no argument. The man paused, momentarily taken aback by the strength in her voice, but he quickly recovered, tightening his grip, his eyes narrowing. "And what if I don't?" he taunted, his smirk widening as he leaned closer. The tension between them crackled in the air, and Leia felt a surge of adrenaline as she prepared to pull away. But before she could act, another figure appeared in the distance, a shadow emerging from the darkness, approaching steadily. The men noticed him too, their laughter faltering as they glanced over, their expressions shifting from arrogance to caution. Leia didn't recognize the figure at first, but as he drew closer, she felt a spark of hope. Maybe this stranger would be the help she needed, someone who would see what was happening and step in, and in that fleeting moment, she clung to the possibility of escape, of breaking free from this nightmare. The figure coming down the street grew clearer under the dim streetlight. Leia's initial flicker of hope faded as the stranger approached, revealing the unmistakable uniform of a police officer. Relief and apprehension mingled in her heart. Surely the presence of an officer would bring her some safety. But something about the way he approached, the lazy gait and the barely concealed smirk on his face, made her uneasy. The men surrounding her fell silent, but their smugness didn't waver. They knew something she didn't, and when the officer finally spoke, his tone was not one of authority or concern. It was laced with amusement. "Well, well, what's going on here?" he asked, his gaze settling on Leia with a glint of something unsettling. Instead of dispersing the group or addressing the men's behavior, he seemed to enjoy the scene before him. Leia took a breath, trying to steady her voice as she attempted to explain. "These men have been following me, making unwanted advances. I just want to get home." The officer tilted his head, pretending to listen with exaggerated patience, but his eyes held none of the empathy she had hoped for. Instead, he shrugged and turned his attention to the men, giving them a friendly nod. "Sounds like a bit of fun got misunderstood, huh?" he said, laughing lightly. His casual dismissal sent a chill down Leia's spine. One of the men, emboldened by the officer's attitude, smirked and stepped forward. "We're just having a friendly chat, officer. She seems a bit uptight." The officer chuckled, nodding as though they'd shared a private joke. Then, turning back to Leia, he leaned in, his expression shifting from casual amusement to something sharper. "Miss, maybe you should be a bit friendlier. Walking around here alone at night, not exactly safe, is it?" The implication in his tone was clear, and Leia's stomach twisted with a mix of anger and fear. She opened her mouth to respond, to defend herself, but before she could, the officer reached out, gripping her arm in a gesture that was anything but gentle. The pressure of his hand was firm, insistent, and his eyes held a glint that told her he had no intention of helping her. "Come on," he said, steering her towards the darkened alley nearby. "Let's have a little chat where it's quieter. You seem a bit too worked up, and I'm here to keep things calm." Leia's pulse pounded in her ears as she tried to pull her arm free. "Let me go," she demanded, her voice trembling despite her attempt to sound strong. But the officer tightened his grip, a smirk forming on his lips as he glanced back at the men, who watched with knowing smirks. They seemed to enjoy the show, their leers deepening as the officer maneuvered her toward the shadowed alley, away from the main road and any potential witnesses. With each step, Leia's fear grew, morphing into a deep-seated anger and a profound sense of betrayal. She had trusted that the police were there to protect, to serve justice. But now, here she was, vulnerable and being treated like a nuisance rather than a person deserving of respect and dignity. Every warning she'd ever received about encounters with corrupt authority figures flashed through her mind, heightening her sense of helplessness. As they entered the alley, the sounds of the city faded, leaving only the oppressive silence of the narrow space. The officer finally released her arm, but blocked her path, his stance making it clear she wasn't free to leave. His face hovered close to hers, a sneer twisting his features as he crossed his arms and looked her over, taking in her fear with something close to satisfaction. "What's wrong? Lost your attitude now?" he taunted, his voice low and menacing. "Out here alone, dressed like that. What did you think would happen?" Leia's voice trembled as she spoke, anger boiling just beneath the surface. "I have every right to walk where I want, and I deserve to be safe." The officer scoffed, shaking his head as if she'd told a foolish joke. "Listen, sweetheart, safety isn't guaranteed for just anyone. You have to earn it, understand?" He took a step closer, his eyes narrowing as he reached for her again. Leia backed away, feeling the wall of the alley pressing into her back. Panic rose within her, memories of her father's voice echoing in her mind. He had always told her to stand tall, to speak up, to never let anyone strip her of her dignity. But what could she do now? Here, alone in the darkness, her voice felt small, her body vulnerable. Just as she was bracing herself to shout, to do something, she heard the distant sound of footsteps, a familiar, steady pace that cut through her rising panic. The officer glanced up, irritation flashing across his face as he registered the approaching figure. But Leia's heart leapt as she recognized the familiar silhouette of her husband, Captain James Daniels, stepping into view. James, tall and commanding in his own police uniform, approached the scene with a look of bewilderment that quickly shifted to rage as he took in what was happening. His eyes locked onto Leia, and in an instant, he understood. His fists clenched at his sides and his jaw set in a tight line, radiating fury. "Officer, what exactly is going on here?" James demanded, his voice low but filled with unmistakable authority. The officer faltered, his earlier confidence waning under the weight of James's gaze. He took a step back, stammering as he tried to explain, his words tumbling out in disjointed phrases. "I was just... She was causing a scene, sir. I was trying to handle it." "Handling it?" James's voice was laced with contempt, and he took a step forward, forcing the officer to back away from Leia. "It looks to me like you're harassing an innocent woman, and not just any woman, my wife." The officer's face went pale, his eyes widening as he processed the information. He took another step back, his demeanor shifting from arrogance to fear as he realized the gravity of his actions. I didn't know, sir. He stammered, but James cut him off with a glare that could have stopped a train. "It doesn't matter if you knew or not," James spat, his voice trembling with barely controlled rage. "You swore an oath to protect people, not intimidate or assault them. And tonight, you've shown yourself unworthy of that uniform." The officer shrank under James's scrutiny, his shoulders slumping as he realized there was no way to talk himself out of this. The men who had harassed Leia earlier had disappeared, sensing that their twisted game had come to an end. Leia watched, a wave of relief mingling with the lingering fear in her heart. She felt a sense of safety return with James's presence, but it was tinged with a bitterness that couldn't be easily washed away. The reality of what had just happened, of how close she had come to being harmed by someone meant to protect her, weighed heavily on her. James turned to her, his expression softening as he reached out, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Are you okay, Leia?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. She nodded, but the tears in her eyes betrayed the calm facade she was trying to maintain. I just wanted to get home," she whispered, the weight of the night's event settling over her. James pulled her into a protective embrace, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. He looked over her shoulder at the officer, who stood frozen in shame and fear. "Get out of my sight," James ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. The officer nodded mutely, retreating into the shadows of the alley, his footsteps fading into the night. As the silence returned, James took a deep breath, his own frustration and helplessness visible in his eyes. The system he'd dedicated his life to, the one he believed in, had shown its flaws tonight. And in that moment, he made a silent vow. He would not let this incident fade into obscurity. It was time to hold those around him accountable, to ensure that the badge represented integrity and justice, not abuse and intimidation. Hand in hand, Leia and James left the alley, their steps synchronized in shared purpose. The night was still, but the weight of the evening lingered between them, and though the danger had passed, the fight was only just beginning. As Leia and James walked in silence through the quiet streets toward their home, an intense energy pulsed between them. The night was cool, but anger radiated from James like a fire, hot and unyielding. Leia felt the pressure of his hand gripping hers, each step measured and firm, as though he were holding himself back from exploding. The events of the night played over and over in James's mind, each detail fueling his frustration. The thought of Leia, alone and harassed, the sight of that officer's smug expression, the lack of immediate help, each memory drove him further into a rage he struggled to contain. This was not just any woman. This was his wife, the love of his life, the person he had vowed to protect. And tonight, he had witnessed firsthand how the system he had devoted his life to could fail even those closest to him. Once they reached the quiet of their apartment, James turned to her, his face a mixture of anger and pain. "Leia, I'm so sorry." His voice trembled with remorse. "I should have been there." Leia looked up at him, her own emotions a whirlwind. "James, this isn't your fault. You're not the one who did this." Her voice was soft but filled with a strength that steadied him. She reached up, gently placing a hand on his cheek. "You stopped it. That's what matters." But James shook his head, his eyes dark and haunted. "It's not enough. I know what I saw tonight, and it's something I can't ignore. That officer, he was supposed to protect you, to keep people like those men away from you. And instead, he turned on you, made you feel like—" His words trailed off, his fists clenching at his sides. Leia could feel his frustration as though it were her own, but beneath his anger she saw something else, something deeper. It was a disappointment in the very system he had dedicated his life to, a sense of betrayal that ran as deep as his love for justice. She had always admired his commitment to his work, his belief that his badge stood for something meaningful. But tonight, she could see that belief starting to crack. "James," she said, her voice gentle, "you've always believed in the good in people. That's one of the reasons I fell in love with you. But you also know that there are people who shouldn't wear that uniform, who don't deserve the power that comes with it." He looked at her, his eyes searching, as though her words were a lifeline he desperately needed to cling to. "I don't know how to fix this, Leia. How can I fight for justice when the very people I'm supposed to trust don't care about it?" "By holding them accountable," she replied without hesitation, a spark of determination igniting in her gaze. "You have a voice, James. People respect you. They look up to you. If anyone can change things, it's you." Her words resonated deeply with him, stirring a sense of purpose that had been buried under his anger. He knew she was right. He couldn't let this go unchallenged. Tonight's events had exposed a sickness within the ranks, a culture of complacency and corruption that he could no longer ignore. And if he truly wanted to make a difference, he had to start with his own precinct. The next morning, James woke early, his mind already racing with plans and ideas. He couldn't afford to wait. Leia watched him as he got ready, the determination in his eyes filling her with both hope and trepidation. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, that he would face resistance from within, but she also knew that he was prepared for the fight. "Promise me one thing," she said, her voice firm as she caught his gaze. "Don't let them make you feel small. You're doing this for the right reasons." James nodded, understanding the weight of her words. He leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "I promise. I'm doing this for you, for us, for everyone who deserves to feel safe." With those words, he left their apartment, his mind focused and his heart resolute. As he walked into the precinct, he felt the weight of his decision settle over him, but it was a weight he was willing to carry. Today, he would begin a new chapter, one dedicated to reforming the very system he had sworn to uphold. Gathering his team in the briefing room, he took a moment to survey the faces before him. Some were familiar, colleagues he had worked with for years, others newer recruits still learning the ropes. But today, he saw them all with fresh eyes, understanding that he could no longer overlook any sign of corruption or abuse. If he wanted to rebuild trust, he had to be willing to face the uncomfortable truths within his own ranks. "I called this meeting because last night something happened that shook me to my core," he began, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "One of our own officers abused his power, targeting an innocent woman when she needed protection the most. This is unacceptable, and I won't stand for it." The room was silent, the air thick with tension. James could see the mix of expressions on his colleagues' faces, some shocked, others uncomfortable, a few defiant. But he pressed on, unwilling to back down. "From this day forward, things will change. I'm implementing new guidelines, stricter protocols to ensure that every officer in this precinct understands their duty to protect, not harm. And anyone found to be violating that duty will face consequences." A murmur rippled through the room, and one of his lieutenants, Officer Mills, spoke up, his tone cautious but firm. "Captain, we've always prided ourselves on having each other's backs. Are you sure this is the direction you want to take?" James met his gaze without hesitation. Having each other's backs doesn't mean ignoring wrongdoings. It means holding each other to the highest standard, because that's what the people we serve deserve. If we can't do that, then we're not worthy of this badge." There was a pause, and James felt a surge of apprehension. He knew his words would not sit well with everyone, that some would resist the changes he intended to make. But he also saw a few nods, subtle gestures of agreement from officers who understood the importance of his message. After the meeting, as the officers dispersed, James stayed behind, watching them file out. His mind was heavy with the weight of his decision, but he felt a new sense of purpose blooming within him. This was only the beginning, the first step in a long journey toward creating the kind of precinct he could be proud of, a place where justice was more than just a word on a mission statement. When he returned home that evening, Leah was waiting for him, her face filled with a mixture of worry and pride. "How did it go?" she asked, her voice soft. "It was hard," he admitted, his shoulders slumping as the exhaustion of the day settled over him. "But I think they understood. Some of them, at least." She wrapped her arms around him, holding him close. "I'm proud of you, James. You're doing what's right. That's what matters." As they stood together in the quiet of their home, James felt a sense of resolve harden within him. The journey ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges and resistance. But with Leah by his side, he knew he could face whatever came his way. In the days that followed, James worked tirelessly, implementing new policies and holding his officers accountable. Some resisted, others supported him, but he never wavered in his mission. Slowly, he began to see a shift, a subtle change in the atmosphere within the precinct. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't without setbacks, but he remained steadfast, determined to honor the promise he had made to Leah and to himself. And as the sun set each evening, casting a warm glow over the city, he knew that he was on the right path, a path toward justice, toward change, and toward a future where people like Leah could walk the streets without fear. The next morning, a heavy silence hung over the precinct. Rumors of Captain Daniel's speech had spread quickly, and the atmosphere was thick with tension. Some officers walked on eggshells, uncertain of how the new changes might affect them, while others avoided James altogether, unwilling to acknowledge his push for reform. James took his place at the head of the table in the conference room, his face stern and focused. Today was a pivotal day, the first of many meetings he would hold to announce and enforce new policies. Every seat was filled, the officers listening with rapt attention, some with folded arms, others with expressions of quiet approval. He could sense their unease, the discomfort that came with change, but he knew this was only the beginning. Clearing his throat, he began, his voice firm and unyielding. "I want to start by saying that I know this isn't easy. Change rarely is. But if we want to earn the trust of the people we serve, we have to hold ourselves accountable. Last night, I saw firsthand what happens when power is abused, and I cannot, in good conscience, allow that to continue." A ripple of whispers passed through the room, but James ignored them, his focus unwavering. "I am implementing new protocols, effective immediately. Officers will undergo mandatory training on ethics and use of power, and regular evaluations will be conducted to ensure compliance. We're also introducing a reporting system for misconduct, and any reports will be taken seriously. No more sweeping things under the rug." A few officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and James could see the doubt flickering in their eyes. Officer Mills, the lieutenant who had spoken up the day before, raised his hand, a look of skepticism on his face. "Captain, I understand what you're trying to do," Mills began cautiously. "But isn't this going to create mistrust among the officers? We're supposed to be a team, and teams need to rely on each other." James nodded, acknowledging Mills's point. "You're right, Lieutenant, but trust is built on integrity, not secrecy. We need to hold each other accountable to build the kind of trust that lasts. If we can't be honest with each other, how can we expect the public to trust us?" Mills's expression softened, though uncertainty remained in his eyes. James understood the fear of losing the camaraderie that had been carefully built over years, fear of change that might disrupt the very foundation of their work. But he knew that this was the only path forward, that any compromise would be a betrayal of the principles he was fighting to uphold. As the meeting continued, he outlined the new policies in detail. His words met with a range of reactions, some skeptical, others openly supportive. By the end, James felt a cautious optimism. There would be resistance, of course, but he also sensed a growing acceptance among some of his colleagues, a recognition that his words came from a place of genuine commitment to justice. After the meeting, James stayed behind, watching the officers file out, their expressions reflecting a mix of hope and hesitation. He caught sight of Officer Ramirez, a younger recruit who had joined the precinct only a few months earlier. Ramirez approached him, a look of admiration in his eyes. "Captain, I just wanted to say thank you," Ramirez said quietly, his voice filled with conviction. "I joined the force because I wanted to make a difference. And seeing you take this stand, it means a lot to me. It gives me hope." James felt a surge of gratitude, a reminder that his efforts were not in vain. "Thank you, Ramirez. It's officers like you that give me hope, too. Stay true to your principles, no matter how difficult things get. That's the only way we'll bring about real change." As Ramirez walked away, James felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew the path ahead would be challenging, that there would be setbacks and resistance, but moments like this made it all worthwhile. The journey was just beginning, and he was prepared to see it through no matter the cost. Later that day, as he returned to his office, James found a letter on his desk, an anonymous note written in careful, blocky handwriting. It read, "Captain, watch your back. Not everyone supports what you're doing." He felt a chill as he read the words, a reminder that not everyone would welcome his push for accountability. But rather than deterring him, the message only strengthened his resolve. Change was never easy, and he was prepared to face the consequences, no matter how personal the cost. That evening, as he walked through the precinct, he overheard snippets of conversation. Some officers discussing the new policies with uncertainty, others expressing cautious optimism. But one voice stood out, filled with bitterness and resentment. "This whole thing is ridiculous," someone muttered under their breath. "All this talk about reform and accountability, it's just going to make our jobs harder. What's the point if we're always watching our own backs?" James paused, his jaw tightening as he listened. He knew that such sentiments wouldn't vanish overnight, that changing the culture within the precinct would be a gradual, sometimes painful process. But he also knew that he had to set an example, to be the kind of leader who led by action as well as words. As he continued down the hall, he was joined by Lieutenant Karen Foster, a seasoned officer with a reputation for integrity. She had been one of the few who openly supported his initiatives, and her presence had been a comfort during the tougher moments of his journey. "Captain, I just wanted to let you know that I'm behind you," she said, her voice steady and reassuring. "I know this won't be easy, but I believe in what you're trying to do. If we're going to create lasting change, it starts with us." James gave her a grateful nod. "Thank you, Karen. Your support means a lot. This isn't something I can do alone." They walked together in silence for a moment, a shared understanding passing between them. Both knew the challenges that lay ahead, the resistance they would face from those unwilling to confront the darker aspects of their profession. But they also knew that this was a fight worth fighting, that real change required courage and determination. As the days turned into weeks, James continued his efforts, conducting regular meetings, reviewing protocols, and holding officers accountable. Some left the precinct, unwilling to adapt to the new standards, while others embraced the changes, inspired by his commitment to justice. The atmosphere within the precinct gradually shifted, becoming more transparent, more focused on serving the community rather than merely enforcing the law. In time, the public began to notice the difference. Complaints of misconduct decreased, and community members expressed a renewed sense of trust in the officers who served them. James felt a profound sense of pride, knowing that his efforts were making a tangible impact, but he also remained vigilant, aware that the journey was far from over, that the fight for justice was a continuous, ever-evolving process. One evening, as he sat at home with Leah, he reflected on the transformation that had taken place. She looked at him with a mixture of admiration and relief, her eyes filled with gratitude for the sacrifices he had made to ensure her safety and the safety of countless others. "You did it, James," she said softly, reaching out to hold his hand. "You're creating the change we always talked about." He nodded, a deep sense of fulfillment settling over him. "I couldn't have done it without you, Leah. You were my reason, my strength, every step of the way." As they sat together, the weight of the past weeks lifted, replaced by a quiet sense of accomplishment. They knew there would always be challenges, that the fight for justice was never truly over. But for the first time, they felt a glimmer of hope, a belief that change was possible, that together they could create a world where people like Leah could walk the streets without fear. And as the night deepened, they looked toward the future with a renewed sense of purpose, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, hand in hand. The early morning light filtered through the kitchen window, casting a warm glow over Leah and James as they sat together, sipping their coffee in comfortable silence. The air felt lighter, the tension of the past weeks finally beginning to fade. James had worked tirelessly, pushing for the reforms that had not only reshaped his precinct, but had started a ripple effect across the department. Officers had begun to adopt the new protocols, and the precinct was gaining a reputation for integrity and transparency. It was a small victory, but one that filled both James and Leah with pride. Leah set her cup down, looking at James with a thoughtful expression. "I've been thinking, James," she began, her tone measured but resolute. "This experience, it's changed me. I don't want to just go back to how things were." James tilted his head, studying her with curiosity. "What do you mean?" She took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "That night, when I was alone in the street, I felt so powerless. It made me realize how many others must feel that way, caught in situations where they have no one to turn to. I don't want to stay silent anymore. I want to do something to help, to make sure no one else has to go through what I did." James reached out, covering her hand with his. "Leah, you've always had a powerful voice. You were the one who gave me the strength to make these changes in the first place. If you want to take that voice further, I'll support you every step of the way." A spark of determination lit up her eyes and she nodded, encouraged by his words. Over the next few days, Leah threw herself into research, looking for ways she could get involved in community activism. She reached out to local organizations focused on social justice, attended workshops, and connected with other activists who shared her vision. Slowly, a plan began to take shape. A network dedicated to supporting individuals who had faced harassment or abuse, providing them with resources, counseling, and a safe space to share their stories. James watched with pride as she grew more involved, her passion rekindled in ways he hadn't seen before. Her drive inspired him to push even further in his own work, and soon they were both dedicating their efforts to creating a safer, more inclusive community. As weeks turned into months, their combined efforts began to yield tangible results. Leah's organization grew, attracting volunteers who were as committed to the cause as she was. She hosted events, facilitated discussions on justice and equality, and organized self-defense classes to empower those who had felt vulnerable in public spaces. Her work began to draw attention, and soon she was being invited to speak at panels, her voice becoming a beacon of hope for others who had felt silenced. James, too, was making strides in his precinct. Officers who had initially resisted the changes were now embracing them, finding renewed purpose in their work. The public trust in the precinct had grown, and James noticed that people in the community began to approach him and his officers with a new sense of openness and respect. Complaints of misconduct continued to decrease, and for the first time in his career, he felt that he was truly making a difference. One evening, as Leah and James sat down for dinner, she shared a story that had touched her deeply. "There was a woman today," she began, her voice soft. "She came to one of our support meetings. She told us about an experience she'd had years ago, something similar to what I went through. She said she'd never spoken about it before, that she thought no one would believe her. But hearing about our group, about the changes in the precinct, it gave her the courage to finally come forward." James listened, his heart swelling with pride and admiration for his wife. "That's incredible, Leah. You've given her, and so many others, a voice. You're creating something that's going to have a lasting impact." Leah smiled, a mix of humility and pride in her expression. "I couldn't have done any of this without you, James. You showed me what it means to fight for what's right, to stand up for justice, even when it's difficult." They shared a quiet moment, the weight of their journey settling between them. They both knew that the work they were doing was far from over, that there would always be challenges and obstacles, but they also knew that together they had the strength to face whatever came their way. Over time, Leah's organization became a recognized force in the community, and her work began to inspire others to take action. People from all walks of life came to her, sharing their experiences, seeking guidance, and finding solace in the supportive network she had built. The precinct, too, continued to evolve, and James was approached by other captains and departments seeking advice on implementing similar reforms. His work was making waves, influencing change beyond the confines of his own precinct. One evening, as they prepared to leave for an event where Leah was scheduled to speak, James took her hand, a soft smile on his face. "You know," he said, his voice filled with warmth, "you're more than just my wife. You're my partner in every sense of the word. I couldn't have done any of this without you." She squeezed his hand, her own smile mirroring his. "And I couldn't have done this without you, James. We're a team." As they walked out together, side by side, they felt a sense of fulfillment that went beyond personal achievement. They were building something meaningful, something that would outlast them both, a legacy of justice, courage, and hope. Their work was far from finished, but they were ready to face the future, knowing that they had each other's unwavering support. And as they moved forward on their new path, they carried with them the knowledge that together they could make the world a safer, more just place for all. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories and skip to the next videos. There are many more exciting stories to come. Write where you're watching from, and let's discuss our heroes together.